Aristotle lived in the 4th century before Christ, before the Common Era, in ancient Greece. He lived most of his life in Athens, but his father was the court physician at the court of Philip of Macedon, who was the father of Alexander the Great. You may not have heard of Philip, but I'm sure you've heard of Alexander the Great. Aristotle actually, he was 17 when he returned to Athens from Macedon. He was sent there by his father to study with Plato, who was the main philosopher of his time. But before he went from Macedon to Athens, Aristotle actually was tutoring Alexander the Great, and they remained very good friends for the rest of Alexander's life. So again, he went to Athens to study with Plato at the first school of philosophy in the Western world, which was known as Plato's Academy, which our word academy and academic come from. And he stayed in Athens until Plato died in 347 BC. After that, Aristotle traveled for 12 years, including into parts of Asia. He came back to Athens in 335 BC and founded the second school of philosophy in the Western world, known as the Lyceum. And the Lyceum continued to exist for about the next 100 years under a variety of teachers. Aristotle had 2 children. His son was named Nicomachus, and that's why this book is called the Nicomachean Ethics. So the legend, at least, is that Aristotle wrote this book as a book of advice for his son, to guide his son in life. Now, we don't have any very good historical evidence of that, but anyway, that's why the book is named Nicomachean, because it's thought to have been written for Aristotle's son, Nicomachus. In addition to being a philosopher, Aristotle was a biologist. He was very interested in all living things. And so one of the things that was part of his relationship with Alexander the Great is, as Alexander would conquer one region after another in his battles, he would have his soldiers gather up all of the plants and animals that were unique to that region and send them back to Aristotle in Athens. And so Aristotle founded the first natural history collection. And he was the first person really to start classifying plants and animals by genus and species. The fact that Aristotle is a biologist, in addition to being a philosopher, means that when he talks about human existence and ethical life, Aristotle thinks the way that a biologist thinks about those things. And that has a couple of different implications. One is that when he's talking about happiness, or he's talking about virtue in particular, or individual virtues that he wants to name, Aristotle will always classify them in terms of a genus and the differentiae of that genus that leads us to the species, the differentiae being the characteristics that set the species apart from other things in its genus. And so you want to watch for that. When Aristotle defines something, he's always defining something the way that a biologist would define it, by first saying what genus it belongs to, what larger class it belongs to, and then what makes it different, those differentiae that make it different from other species within that same group. The other implication, main implication of Aristotle being a biologist, is that when he talks about human beings, he's talking about an animal in a natural environment. And so he thinks of us, when he asks the question about ethics, he's doing something like the care tag on the plant that you bought for your dorm room, you know, that little plastic tag that sticks down in the dirt that tells you you need this much light and this much water, and you know, this needs to not be in, you know, near wind or an air conditioning vent or something like that. What Aristotle is looking for is an answer to the question, what is the best life for a human being? And of course, those conditions, the care tag or the, you know, the video that tells you how to take care of your dog or a particular breed or some kind of pet, that's asking the human being to set up the conditions necessary for that plant or animal to thrive. In the case of human beings, we are ourselves responsible for setting up the conditions, the kind of life, form of life that we need to lead in order to really thrive as the kind of being that we are. So we want to watch. Often when you're reading something in the Nicomachean Ethics and you're asking yourself, why would Aristotle approach the question in this way? The answer to that is because he's thinking about human life and he's thinking about ethics the way that a biologist does. Now, he defines a human being in a certain way. He defines us as rational and political animals. And we need to think about this definition of the human being as a rational and a political animal, because it's not being rational and it's not being political that sets us apart from other animals. It's being a particular combination of rational and animal. So there are other rational animals. There are animals, and Aristotle knows this better than most of us do. Animals have different levels of intelligence. And we are probably at the top of that chain, at least as far as animals on the earth. But there is a whole chain or spectrum, if you want to use that metaphor, of levels of intelligence. And we're intelligent in certain ways. There are other animals too that are political. Essentially, when Aristotle says that we're political animals, he's not saying that we are naturally Republican or libertarian or democratic or socialist. What he's talking about is that we are naturally social beings. We naturally organize ourselves into social groups. And of course, there are other social animals. There are other animals, many other animals, who organize themselves into groups. So you have herds of this kind of animal, dogs travel in packs, wolves, and so forth. Other animals are not terribly social. So some of the large felines, large cats, tend to hunt on their own, for instance. They would not be thought of as social or political animals by Aristotle, but many of them do. Now, the other thing that's really important to understand about Aristotle's definition of the human being as rational and especially as political is political comes from the Greek word polis, which means a city-state, right? So Athens was a city-state in Aristotle's time. What it means to be a city-state, to be a polis, is to be a city, usually with a wall around it, with its own army, and if it's on the water like Athens is, it has its own navy because it has its own port. And so it has its own laws, its own constitution. It defends itself. So imagine if Santa Monica had a wall around it, and it had its own army and its own navy, and Culver City had a wall around it, and it had its own army, its own constitution, couldn't have a navy because it's not on the water. And let's say Beverly Hills or West Hollywood were the same, wall around them. So this is how the Greek city-states are arranged. So you have a social grouping of a limited kind, of a limited size that is self-governing. So when Aristotle says that human beings are political animals, what he has in mind is a polis, that human beings naturally organize ourselves into social groups of a limited size that are within that social group self-governing. They have some kind of set of laws or rules, at least, that holds them together and orders them as a social group. The other thing that we have to acknowledge about Aristotle is that Athens at his time is racist, homophobic, and xenophobic. I'll look at each one of those. So it's, well, racist and xenophobic in the sense that you had to be born in Athens to be a citizen. So if you were Greek, but you were from another city-state like Sparta, for instance, you could not be a citizen and vote in Athens. And certainly not, for instance, if you were from Egypt or one of the surrounding countries from what would later become Italy, for instance, you were considered a foreigner and you couldn't get citizenship and vote in Athens no matter what. But also many of the foreigners who were in Athens were actually held as slaves. So they were very suspicious of foreigners. Foreigners could never gain citizenship there, and against people of other ethnicities who would most commonly be held as slaves. The misogynistic part is that women could never be citizens. Women actually, even women of noblemen, did not have shoes because they never left the house once they got married. They stayed at home. And if someone was going to go out and do some shopping or something for them, or someone needed to go and get the doctor some medicine, something like that, it was always the slave who was sent out to do it, and usually the male slave. And the extreme of this, you can see how extreme this is by looking at the Athenian houses, which have no windows on the outside. All the windows are on the inside facing an interior courtyard, and that so that the women cannot see out and possibly interact with men who are on the street. It's also, I mentioned, there's one more epithet that I need to add, or adjective that I need to add to that, and it is that Athens was very much of a classist society in the sense that you could only be a citizen if you owned property. So you had to be relatively wealthy in order to have a say in what happened in Athens. Athens was the first democracy in the West, but it was a democracy that was far more biased and less liberal and progressive than the one we have today. So the ethical question for Aristotle, the way that he most often puts it is, what is the best life for a human being? And he goes about that, again, the way that a biologist does. He's asking for a being like us that is rational and political. What is the form of life that will lead to our greatest striving? Aristotle's philosophy has been hugely influential in subsequent history. So especially in the Middle Ages, you have philosophers from Christianity, from Islam and Judaism, all drawing on Aristotle as a way to interpret their religion's doctrines. So Thomas Aquinas for Christians, Avicenna for Muslims, Maimonides for Jews, all drew on Aristotle. And it's interesting that they do that because Aristotle did not believe the world was created. He thought that the universe had always existed. And Aristotle didn't believe in an afterlife, didn't believe in life after death. And of course, those three Abrahamic religions that I just mentioned believe very strongly in both of those things. So there's some question in Judaism about an afterlife. We tend not to focus on it, but definitely creation. That's a whole story in itself. But when Aristotle asks, what's the best life for a human being? He's asking the biological question, what is the life that allows the human being to most fully thrive?